Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Miller Center. Do turn off your cell phones if you have them handy and are worried that they might go off during the show. I'm Will Hitchcock. I teach history at the university, and I'm also the director of academic programs here at the Miller Center. And this is one of an ongoing series of discussions under the title of the Great Issues program here at the Miller Center. And the Great Issues program, as some of you have heard me say before, is an effort to take scholarship and scholars on particularly important historical and social scientific topics and get them talking about current events. So to put current events into historical perspective and to use a little bit of broad thinking and scholarly knowledge to illuminate problems of the contemporary world and the contemporary scene. So last December, the United States Senate Select Committee on Intelligence released to the public a portion of a very long and still mostly classified study about the CIA's Detention and Interrogation program, a program that was started soon after 9/11 and was mostly wrapped up by late 2006, early 2007. In that time, about 119 people were held by the CIA in custody, and 39 people were subjected to a regime of enhanced interrogation. The committee chairperson of the Senate Select Committee's report that we'll be discussing today, Senator Dianne Feinstein, stated in her report that, quote, under any common meaning of the term, CIA detainees were tortured, unquote. Furthermore, she stated the conditions of their confinement and the techniques used upon these detainees were, quote, cruel, inhuman, and degrading. These are taken from the opening pages of the Senate's report. Much of the information that was revealed in that report, which came out, was released to the public at the end of last year, had been, bits and pieces of it have been released to the public in different forms over the preceding few years. It wasn't the first time we had learned about some of these practices. But the report was very powerful nonetheless because it placed in one report, a long report, though not the whole thing, it gave us a sense of insight into the scale and the scope and the nature of the CIA's detention and interrogation program. It's all in one place, and it came from an authoritative body, the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. It was also based, we were told, on millions of pages of still classified documents. So we believe, we've been told that the authors who wrote the report consulted that material and drew a number of very pointed conclusions by looking at that classified material. We are not going to see that classified material probably for a very long time. So this may be as close as we can get to some of that material. But I think what we'll hear today as we ask our guests to talk a little about the report is that the report remains very controversial. The way that it was put together, the methodology behind it, the sources that they used, there's so much that we don't know about the report, and it makes a lot of accusations, some of which have been subject to doubt and to question. So it's a great moment to reflect not just on how this particular document was created and how we learn in the public about the CIA and its role in the global war on terror, but it's also a time to reflect just upon how little we still know about the scale and scope of some of our agencies and their practices during the global war on terror. So in our discussion today, we're going to hear from three people to try to make sense of this report and to talk generally about the CIA's role and the U.S. government's role in using certain practices that many of us obviously feel uncomfortable with, but which, whether we like it or not, have had a prominent place in our ongoing conflict in the global war on terror. So we have three speakers. Each one is going to speak on a variety of topics which they've sort of agreed on ahead of time. And each will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, and I think we'll have a lively conversation. Let me introduce the three speakers all at once, and then they'll each go in order. Richard Immerman is the Edward Bethusium Family Distinguished Faculty Fellow in History and the Marvin Wachman Director of the Center for the Study of Force and Diplomacy at Temple University in Philadelphia. He's also the Francis Desario Chair of Strategic Intelligence at the U.S. Army War College. He formerly served as Assistant Deputy Director of the National Intelligence for Analytic Integrity and Standards and Analytic Ombudsman for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. You can tell that he worked in the government because all of his titles are incredibly long, complicated, and difficult to summarize. But he's also a great historian, and he's written widely on the history of the CIA in many times and many places. Most recently, The Hidden Hand, A Brief History of the CIA, also the Central Intelligence Agency, Security Under Scrutiny. And his first book was a prize winner and an absolute breakthrough, The CIA in Guatemala, The Foreign Policy of Intervention. Next, we'll have Fred Hitz, well known to some of you in this audience. Fred Hitz has held positions with the CIA and the Department of State, Defense, and Energy. And he's also served as managing partner of the law firm of Schwab, Williamson, and Wyatt from 1982 to 1990. Mr. Hitz is on this panel mainly because he was appointed the CIA's first statutory inspector general by George H.W. Bush. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Virginia Law School and a senior lecturer in the Frank Batten School. Benjamin Wittes is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, a member of the Hoover Institution's Task Force on National Security and Law, and the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Lawfare blog. Some of you will know Lawfare. If you don't, I highly recommend it to you as a place for pointed, interesting, well-informed debate and discussion about the relationship between law and the pursuit of national security. Really interesting. I commend you, Ben, for putting this together and for leading it. Constantly surprising new material is posted on Lawfare that is well worth perusing. Your check will be check's in the mail. It's easy money for me up here. I just say nice things. He has served as an editorial writer for the Washington Post and a reporter and editor at Legal Times, and his books include Detention and Denial, The Case for Candor After Guantanamo, Law and the Long War, The Future of Justice in the Age of Terror, and Legislating the War on Terror, An Agenda for Reform. What I'd like to do is ask Richard Immerman to kick things off with a few comments on the historical dimensions of this story, and then we'll go with Fred Hitz. And Benjamin Wittes will bat cleanup. So, Richard? I think, yeah, it's mic'd. You feel in command of the room. As a matter of fact, I'm in charge here.
Right. Actually, I should do that. I'm one of the few people who it's dangerous to put a microphone in front of me. I'm loud, and I talk louder as I go along, so I'll try to sort of step back. Begin by thanking Will for inviting me. I was here a couple years ago for a conference. It's a wonderful setting, and it's always a wonderful audience, and for that reason, I'll try to keep my remarks short to allow maximum time for the question and answer period to follow. So really what I'm going to do is just make a couple overarching comments, judgments, really in the hope that I will both provoke questions and frame a discussion that we'll have afterward. And the first of these judgments is that regardless of assessments of the effectiveness of the CIA's rendition, detention, and interrogation program, RDI, everything in government, as you know, is acronym, so I'll try to save time by doing that. And specifically, the use of enhanced interrogation techniques. In my judgment, the costs of the program far outweighed whatever benefits we derived. I'm going to come back to the questions of assessing the benefits, or basically what intelligence the CIA acquired or did not acquire through using these techniques. But really that question, which is fundamental to what we would discuss, is just one, and I think a relatively minor one or variable in a much larger equation. For American foreign policy to be successful, and it's for its security interests to be served, the strategies and programs that the United States pursues must be aligned with its ideals and values. That axiom, I think, is particularly salient when applied to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, or what was once referred to as the global war on terror. These conflicts, as captured by George W. Bush's own explanation for the 9/11 strategy, are as politically and ideologically driven as any conflicts the United States has been engaged in throughout its history. They hate us because of our democratic institutions and freedoms, President Bush claimed. And while this explanation certainly is reductionist or simplistic to some extent, Bush was right in that the conflict was not primarily fought over territory or resources or other of the conventional routes of war. It was in recognition of this political and ideological quality to America's battles and the concern for the growing wave of anti-Americanism that the president brought Karen Hughes back into the White House. As she explained why she was appointed Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy with the rank of ambassador, and that was very significant at that time, her charge was to, quote, bridge the perceived disconnect between U.S. actions abroad and the values its officials championed in public. This disconnect was costing the United States vital support in Iraq, where the United States was experiencing such grief, and really depriving it of one of its most powerful weapons in waging this war. Hughes was hardly successful, and while the RDI program was not the primary reason for her failure, if only because, at least at that time, it was not widely known, it was unquestionably symptomatic of the disconnect between U.S. actions and values. It exacerbated that disconnect, and it ultimately came to symbolize that disconnect, certainly as much as Abu Ghraib or other of the areas that became so notable. The fact that as early as 2005, Congress enacted legislation prohibiting, quote, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment of any prisoner captured during the war. And President Bush himself was compelled to publicly state that the United States does not torture its prisoners, certainly suggests that the United States was perceived to be torturing prisoners, and that doing so was no longer a secret. At his inauguration, Barack Obama called the choice between America's safety and American ideals a false one. Maybe later we can debate the morality and legality of detention versus using drones and doing killing lists. I mean, that itself is really quite revealing. But at least in his inauguration, Obama framed the choice correctly, and that the administration did seem to make a choice on one side of this equation. Appropriately, albeit perhaps ironically, it was Senator John McCain who probably assessed the hazards of the EIT program most bluntly, really foreshadowing what the Sisi report would conclude. When calling for the release of the report in 2012, or at least some of the report, McCain, himself of course a victim of torture, stated that, quote, the cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of prisoners, and he had authored the legislation in 2005, is wrong in principle, a stain on our country's conscience, and unworthy of our national honor. Then, following the release of the report, or its executive summary, he went on to say, the use of torture compromises that which most distinguishes us from our enemies, our belief that all people, even captured enemies, possess basic human rights, and then goes on and on. To use this method, he concluded, neither is in the best interests of justice, nor the ideals we have sacrificed so much blood and treasure to defend. Now, I use the word ironic as well as appropriate because McCain, of course, is a Republican and a Republican hawk. to boot. And this is vital to the second overarching point or judgment that I want to make. And it has to do with the incredible politicization of the Senate's report. McCain went beyond calling out the program for being incompatible with American values and traditions. He was no less uncompromising in arguing that the program was ineffective, that it failed to secure the actionable intelligence for which it was purportedly designed. Now, I'll mention briefly that I would not go as far as McCain, be so categorical in that there was not any evidence, valuable evidence provided. But what I think is important is that McCain was reaching this conclusion, and he was a Republican. The politicization of the Sissy report is extreme, even given the politicized congressional investigations of the CIA and the intelligence community that preceded it. Not a single Republican on the committee was willing to concede that there was any merit to McCain's assessment, or for that matter, the report had any value whatsoever. And this rebuttal, which was published as the minority response, actually surpassed even that of the CIA. Now the CIA's response itself, which was endorsed and reinforced by every leader of the agency, was emphatic in arguing that EITs produced, quote, unique intelligence that led terrorist plots to be disrupted, terrorists to be captured, and lives to be saved. That was the line that ran through it. The agency also rejected the claim that it had insufficiently briefed or deliberately misrepresented the program to Congress, the White House, and the Department of Justice, not to mention the media and actually its own Office of the Inspector General. The CIA even maintained that its use of techniques such as rectal rehydration and rectal feeding were medically warranted and therefore would not be classified. Now, I will spare you the description of what this is. If you have time and read the report, it's really gruesome, but it certainly raises serious questions about the credibility of at least that part of the defense. Given all of that, and notwithstanding the circle of wagons thrust, the CIA did concede that it had made some mistakes, that its operatives were unprepared, that certain techniques that were used were unauthorized, that there were some questionable legal efforts, things such as that. In addition, the CIA also conceded that it used imprecise language, which may well have suggested that the value of the information acquired was greater than it really was, or about how the techniques were conducted themselves. And it also admitted at the end of the day that some of this information, perhaps all of this information, could have been acquired by less coercive techniques, although, as it said, they will never know, and of course, we will never know. In the words of the current DCI, John Brennan, quote, agency officers used interrogation techniques that had not been authorized, were abhorrent, and rightly should be repudiated by all. Whatever one thinks of the CIA's response, I don't think there's any question that it had an institutional interest to defend, and it also needed to protect its own agents who would possibly be subjected to prosecution. And I understand that. It's much more difficult, therefore, to explain, though, the minority's response to this. How one party could look at the same evidence and come to 180-degree different. There's no reason that should have happened. But in fact, what happened is the Republican Party didn't really zero in on CIA behavior as much as it did the Democrats themselves. Criticizing the report from up to, it did not raise questions about the morality, it didn't refer to the preparation, it didn't do really any of that. Basically, what it did is describe the report as, quote, an exercise of partisan politics, lamented it, quote, has cost the American taxpayer more than $40 million and diverted countless CIA analytic and support resources, and calling into question the report's methodology, challenged virtually every one of the report's, quote, questionable and inflammatory conclusions attacking the CIA's integrity and credibility. Yet, it concluded, even the study's flawed analytic methodology cannot suppress the reality that the CIA's detention and interrogation program set up an effective cycle of events whereby al-Qaeda terrorists were, and here it is, removed from the battlefield, which had a disruptive effect on the current terrorist activities and often permitted the intelligence community to collect additional intelligence, which in turn led back to the capture of more terrorists. While I'm not pulling any punches in lambasting the Republicans for politicizing what is an absolutely essential debate for Americans to have, I do not want to suggest that the Democrats were any more above politics. The report is extremely thorough and very rigorous. The executive summary itself extends to some 500 pages, includes more than 2,500 footnotes, many of which are long with multiple citations and explanation. The report itself, I'll just mention for the record, Will mentioned earlier, runs to more than 6,500 pages and has over 38,000, I will repeat, 38,000 footnotes. Not that any of us, I think, will ever see any of them. But that said, the report reads like a prosecutor's brief, absent and lacks the slightest nuance, the slightest caveat, or any indication that sources, data, can be interpreted differently. It also has no recognition of the complexity of intelligence analysis. A lot of the report is persuasive, at least to me, it's convincing. But in assessing the effectiveness of the program, that's when the sissy really crosses the line. As I said, it's probably the wrong question to ask whether or not it was effective, or at least I can make that case. But it had to be asked in the context of this report. And it also has to be admitted, or should be admitted, that categorical answers are almost impossible to reach. Even intelligence collected about what might already have been known, which is one of the Sissy report's conclusion, and misleading or fabricated intelligence can provide insight and be useful in terms of penetrating a very hard target. And anyone who knows anything about intelligence knows that analytic judgments often exceed the sum of their parts, and it's often impossible to trace a judgment to any one of these parts. Am I about done? So let me just conclude. Basically, so what I'm saying is that it's as partisan as the Republicans. And in large part because of that, the issue is not settled. It's a he said, she said type of thing, and we don't know what it is, which I think is very unfortunate, and I also think will contribute to the lack of anything particularly constructive coming out of this exercise, other than perhaps conversations like we're having now. And I say this for three different reasons. The CIA, the core mission of the CIA, when it was established, was to provide policymakers with intelligence analysis to reduce their uncertainty in making decisions. It was not even chartered to collect intelligence, let alone engage in covert and paramilitary activities. The agency acquired these responsibilities incrementally and largely by default. No one else wanted to do them. The CIA's experience interrogating prisoners was very limited before this, and its role in the program, I think, is consistent with this history of mission creep. Yet the debate over the program and all the reports and responses have ignored the question of whether these activities are the best use of the CIA's resources and what have been the effects on the agency. Sidestepping these questions is irresponsible and counterproductive. The final thing I just want to say is that the fact that polls universally show that Americans, at the same time that they agree that this is torture, also agree that they're useful. So in other words, they agree on both sides of both of the reports, and while that could be a cause for reflection, I think it's more likely to be a cause of paralysis and amnesia. Thanks a lot.
I'm going to speak to you this afternoon as a former career intelligence official at CIA. I have read with interest the part of the report that we were able to look at, and I'm certainly going to follow very closely the efforts to get out the rest of it and where it will lead. But what I want to concentrate on and what I want to try to leave with you is something that Richard referred to in the very end of his talk. This is something that CIA had no business doing. We didn't know anything about enhanced interrogation. And more to the point, our past showed that when we had been put into a situation where we were responsible for hostile interrogations, we didn't do a good job. And I'm referring to the Hamlet program in Vietnam and some of the earlier instances where CIA tried to use methods to draw out information from foreign subjects and was perceived as not really up to that mission. And this is the important point that I want you to think about. During that period from Vietnam until the 9/11 business, so poisonous was the area of hostile interrogations. The Directorate of Operations officers who encountered it in connection with their work with liaison services were required to leave the room. We were out of that business. So you have a situation where the moral aspect of it is one thing, and a terribly important one, perhaps the most. The ability to do it is another. And as to that, CIA had to go to school after 9/11 when it wanted to get into the business. What CIA brought to the program was the fact that it could get an agreement from some of its friends around the world, Romania, Poland, Thailand, to set aside areas where we could conduct these interrogations undisturbed, and for whatever period of time we needed to do it. And it would, of course, remain outside the public eye. That was a tremendous advantage. What we couldn't bring to the matter, however, is any skill in or experience in conducting these interrogations. And what we chose to do, and you've seen it referred to in the press, we tried to hire several expert psychologists who had worked with the military's SERE program, that is the Escape and Evasion program that was was taught to the military. It began during the Korean War period, and it sought to prepare airmen principally for the possibility of them being shot down and held in an effort to get information out of them. The individuals who taught the CIA officers how to do this had themselves, however, never indulged in hostile interrogations. They were really experts on the psychological damages and how to protect soldiers from being hurt in that situation. They hadn't themselves been in the business of acquiring this information. So they had to go to school. And if you've read the articles that have been written, an enormous amount of money was paid to them to give this instruction to our personnel who were going to actually conduct the interrogations. Furthermore, CIA, having gone through the Iran-Contra business and several other difficult situations, determined that it needed some strong legal support for what it was going to do. And it shows. We had here at the Miller Center several months ago John Rizzo talking about his book. He was the lawyer in charge at CIA, had went to the office of, in the Department of Justice responsible for giving the official interpretation of American statute to find out what it was that CIA officers could do. What were the limits of the methods we could use to conduct a so-called lawful but hostile interrogation? And that's where we got into the business of waterboarding and hours standing and introduction of heat into rooms and that sort of thing. Well, what it did not take account of is that these techniques can't be learned in a matter of a 2-week preparation, which is about what our guys had before they started it. They needed a long history of working in that kind of atmosphere and with that kind of pressure. The FBI does it. The FBI has an interrogation system, but they can't introduce any information, into a federal court unless it is arrived at lawfully, that it meets the requirements of constitutional practice. So they can't go but so far. And the military does it in the context of collecting prisoners the same way that we were taking that instruction for the pilots in case they'd been shot down in hostile territory. So there were other entities that knew more about it than we did, but we had one essential positive going for us, and that is this could all take place out of the eye of cameras, reporters, and the world in these secret prisons. Now you take a look, and it's all been published. I know you've read it, the techniques which were approved. An officer, a CIA interrogator, uses these techniques on a person whom he's morally certain knows something more than he's been told. But he clams up and doesn't say anything. There were no time limits on going back to use these techniques. And I would offer that if you're going to waterboard Khalid Sheikh Mohammed 38 times, that's torture by any standard. And I would argue that that process probably means that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who most people believe was the mastermind behind the 9/11 attack, will probably never go before a U.S. court. He's now in a magistrate's kind of informal practice situation now, but I don't think he'll ever be taken before a federal court. So what I'm trying to say is, aside from the moral questions, which I admit are principally important here, that it was wrong, that it was illegal, it was using cruelty, which is illegal under U.S. law, but more to the point, done by a bunch of operators who were not schooled in what had to be done, was completely ineffective. Therefore, it seems to me we have created a situation that we should have avoided. CIA should not have been involved in this. Now, one of my successors as Inspector General at CIA did look into this. And there's a report out there, in addition to this long novel that the committees have put out, an effort on the part of the Inspector General internally to turn this thing around and back us out of it as quickly as we could. That didn't work out. So I would say wrong, ineffective, and set us back. And remember, all of you, what kicked this whole business off? It wasn't the fact that, although the information was there, that there was concern about these techniques. It was Abu Ghraib. It was a bunch of reserve officers, many from Pennsylvania, who had no long standing term to concern themselves about in minding these prisoners at Abu Ghraib in Iraq, but did put on girly underwear and the rest on these prisoners over the weekend because they were bored, and then took pictures of them, which was bound to get out. Which is another point to say, if you don't play by the rules, you've got to be ready for the fact that it will out. These things do. Thank you.
Sorry, I have a bit of a cough, so if I start hacking, please forgive me. So I want to start by disclosing a perhaps debilitating set of conflicts of interest when I talk about these subjects. So one of them is that I actually think the world of the Senate Intelligence Committee, with whom I have done a fair bit of work on issues of surveillance, including the majority side, the then majority side that produced this report. And I think the world of Dianne Feinstein's work in that area. So the second is that a bunch of the people who are the subjects of this report are personal friends of mine. And I have a lot of admiration for many things that they did and many things that they tried to do, including some stuff that is heavily criticized in this report. So I have the odd experience of a group of people that I have, sort of worked with and admire, investigating a group of people whom I know well in some cases, am personal friends with in other cases, and admire, and concluding that they are liars and torturers, and not knowing at some very personal level kind of how to reconcile the things that people I think highly of are saying about other people I think highly of. Normally, I would exempt myself from the conversation on that basis alone, because I think a lot of the conversation about this report has been awful. I have sort of gotten involved with it against, to some degree, my better judgment. So I want to say that this report is an extremely ambitious undertaking, and it is more successful in certain areas of that undertaking than in other areas. I very much agree with Professor Immerman's formulation at the end of his remarks. But I want to tick off the things that the report attempts to establish, and then give a few thoughts about where it does so well and where it does not. Because I think actually the merits of it vary a lot. So the first general proposition of the report is that the program is dramatically more brutal than had been previously understood. Now there is, that was actually, we were largely aware of that, but the report is, I think, quite effective and quite significantly changed my understanding of what this program actually was in practice, rather than in the kind of antiseptic legal opinions that had come out of the Justice Department, which had been based on representations by the CIA of what they meant to do, right? And what you mean to do when you conduct a coercive interrogation program, and then what people actually do, can be very, very different. And so this document, which goes through the cables that describe what actually happened in the program is quite shocking in a lot of places. The only thing you can say in defense of the CIA on this point, as far as I'm concerned, is two things. One is, of course it was. Of course, the things that happened on the ground are never quite the same as at the policy level. And that's a very weak defense, by the way. And number two, and more significantly, the report is a little bit unfair in characterizing these things as happening throughout the program. In fact, they almost all happened in the first early months of the program. The CIA kind of cleans it up. By mid-2003, it is running at a very different and higher level than it had been before. So, but by and large, if the committee had stopped at the proposition that, hey, this program was way nastier than you thought, I would wholeheartedly endorse it. The second proposition is that the program was almost entirely ineffective. And by ineffective, what the committee means is that it did not, in any instance, produce life-saving, plot-thwarting intelligence that was not available by other means. Now, I think on this point, where they have really landed a blow is the idea that the CIA was a little bit too invested in the proposition that this was life-saving intelligence unavailable by other means, and they kind of hyped some of the results that they had. I think the CIA's response to this report on this point is quite persuasive, actually. And I think that the minority, the Republican response, in some areas is quite devastating. The majority was very committed to this result and overlooked, and in my judgment, took some significant liberties with important facts by way of establishing it. The most dramatic of them is that the majority rejects the entirety of the idea that Abu Zubaydah provided under coercion critical intelligence, and asserts that all of the valuable stuff that he gave up was given up in rapport-building interrogations with the FBI before he was subjected to enhanced interrogation. And both the CIA and the minority actually does a pretty effective job at this, point out that, in fact, during this period, he was also subject to some pretty brutal interrogation tactics. And so the neat division that the majority makes between the before and after is actually not neat at all. In fact, I think the CIA is quite right to point out that you cannot, this is not a controlled experiment. You cannot turn back the clock and figure out what the take would have been had you used a different set of techniques. As uncomfortable as that is, I think that's probably right. The third general proposition of the report is that the CIA systematically misrepresented the account, both the brutality and the techniques and the take to the oversight mechanisms in Congress. Now, part of the merits of this claim hinge on the previous claim, because a lot of the claims that they are accusing the CIA of having misrepresented are claims of effectiveness. So if you believe the program was more effective than they believe it is, it follows that those claims were less false than they believe it is. The merits here, I think, are mixed. I think they make a pretty persuasive case that the CIA, did not, first of all, there's no dispute that the CIA briefed Congress very narrowly. It limited briefings to a very, very small number of people. And one of the subtexts here that I think is very important is that the people who led this review were not people who were briefed early. And so I think part of what happened here is that the committee was shocked. The members of the committee were shocked when they were finally briefed to find out what was really going on. And there's a lesson in that, which is if you're going to undertake really serious forward-leaning intelligence operations, brief more widely rather than less. Get Congress invested in what you're doing. And by the way, that's exactly what the NSA did. And that's the reason that Dianne Feinstein is the fiercest defender on the Hill of these NSA programs, even as she's attacking the CIA. It's a degree of, does she feel like when the truth comes out that she's blindsided by it, that she didn't know what was going on? So I do think on that, the committee has some legitimate grievance. On the other hand, I go back to what I said before. If you think the program was more effective than the committee thinks it is, a lot of the lies that they are alleging don't seem like lies anymore. They seem like accounts of what these people believed their take was. Finally, and here is the least discussed, actually, and to my mind, the most interesting conclusion of the report, which is that not only did the CIA misrepresent the program to its congressional overseers, but it misrepresented the program to the Bush administration. Now, when you thought about this program before this whole episode of this report came out, you probably thought that the lurking dark presence behind the whole detention and interrogation program was Dick Cheney and his Eminence Greaves counsel, David Addington, right? And it turns out, I'm sure, by the way, that the members of the committee, when they were doing this investigation, that was one of the things they wanted to establish. And the report actually presents the White House as one of the principal victims, the subject of repeated misrepresentations by the CIA. And Cheney barely shows up in it. You know, Bush is presented as a victim of these misrepresentations. Now, this is a very, very strange turn of events, because the normal pattern when Congress, blows the whistle on a terrible overreach by one of the intelligence agencies is that the political echelon runs for cover, right? We didn't know what they were doing. Here, the opposite is happening. Congress is saying the political echelon really didn't know what was going on, and the political echelon is rushing to say, yes, we did, and we stand by it. This is unique, as far as I know, in the history of intelligence scandals. So let me give you a couple of, it's really a weird development. Let me give you a few examples of how extreme this is. George W. Bush, in his memoir, describes a incident in which George Tenet comes to him, tells him he's going to do waterboarding, and basically says it's going to be nasty. And Bush says, have at it, right? And he personally, in this memoir, takes responsibility for this instance. The committee says it never happened. John Rizzo, in his memoir, says it never happened. The principal person out there defending the CIA in public has been Dick Cheney. He's not a figure in this report. He's taking responsibility for things that they are not accusing him of. I have never seen, in the history of intelligence scandals, I think this is unique. Why is it happening? It's happening because, for I think, two reasons. One is because I think the Bush administration people understand that this program is part of their legacy, whether they take responsibility for it or not. And so they're being smart, and they're taking responsibility for it. Second reason is I think they probably knew about as much as they wanted to know. And the question of how briefed you wanted to be here, the answer to that is not necessarily, please tell me every detail that you're doing. You have my general permission for this program. Go do it. I don't necessarily need to know the details. Now, Congress, in retrospect, feels betrayed by not knowing the details. A lot of the senior Bush administration people maybe do not. Now, that is not true of all of them. And this is where I do think the committee is getting to a certain truth, and I'll stop here. There are members of the senior levels of the administration who, the more they learned about the program, the more anxiety they developed about it. And the most public of those was Condi Rice, who in her State Department period, she and her counsel, John Bellinger, really did a lot to put a stop to this program and to force a different level of consideration of it. Interestingly, Condi has not been out there either, saying I was lied to, or saying, yes, yes, I knew every detail and I approved every detail. So there's a very complicated relationship that I think the report did something to shed light on, but what sheds even more light on is the reaction to the report, which between as to the relationship between the agency and its political overseers in the Bush administration. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, the three of you, for such a really interesting kickoff. What a fascinating set of problems we have in front of us. Can I just take the first question and follow up with Ben on the accountability question, which is, it seems as if the report is, as you say, the report lets the White House off the hook because the White House was misled. The CIA didn't tell the truth to the White House, apparently, according to the report. Does that then point the finger of accountability somewhere else? Is there a hidden message in the Senate's report that, yes, the people who really were responsible for both misleading the White House as well as triggering this much more aggressive, much more brutal interrogation policy, they could be named. We know who they are. We know where they live. Is there a sense in the document, maybe between the lines, that there should be some accountability that isn't actually in the White House? Or is that also missing from the report?
It's a very interesting question. And I think the answer is that the report, so first of all, a lot of names are scrubbed from the report. And so you actually, it's not just reading between the lines, it's more importantly reading between the redactions. One of the oddest features of the report is the degree to which the person who's most named as sort of the responsible actor is General Hayden, who was the head of the CIA after the most aggressive period of this program, and actually was the one who did more briefing than any of his predecessors. And so, I do think there is to the extent they're talking about the CIA leadership, I think they really do put an unfair amount of responsibility on Mike Hayden. One of the weaknesses of the report, in my judgment, is that it conflates what I think of as 3 or 4 very different failures, policy failures. So one is, did you authorize a set of practices and behaviors that we think should not have been authorized, either because they were illegal or they were immoral or because they would be ineffective, right? So one is, at the policy level, did you seek and get permission and give permission to do bad things? The second is, did people do bad things in the context of a program that didn't authorize them? And those are ground level failures of individuals and oversight mechanisms to the extent that you didn't pick them up and punish them, right? The third then is, did you give an honest account of both the policy level and the operational failures and the management failures to overseers both in the White House and elsewhere in the executive branch and in the legislature? And these, I think reasonably, these 3 sets of failures alleged failures would rest on very different people, right? One is bad people doing bad things in the field. One is the management of the program not creating systems that prevent that. And one is the policy level people, which would really be the CTC, the Counterterrorism Center leadership, and the heads of the agency, not, asking for and getting permission to do things that we regret. The document unfortunately conflates those things to a significant degree, and I think that actually weakens it.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Richard Everman said that it read like a prosecutor's brief rather than a historical account, and that may be the tip-off.
But
Right?
if I could just add something very quickly.
Use your mic.
Which is, I think, important just for context, is that the committee had absolutely no access to the White House records. That this report was written based on material provided by the CIA. So these key questions of accountability and decision-making and authorization, from everything we know about the CIA, I would say without question that this was authorized by the White House. The CIA does not undertake this program without authorization from the White House. But there's no record of that, and therefore it's absent in the report. Part of the problem between the CISI and the CIA were questions of computers and when the CISI staff got access to the Panetta Review and other things, which was not part of these records. So the CIA was actually very liberal in what it provided, but this is not the entire set of material that a historian would use in trying to get at this, and in all likelihood, well, certainly in our lifetime, we won't have access to that material.
Let the record show that Richard Everman feels that 6 million pages of documents is just not enough for a historian.
Not enough, right.
We really need at least 6 times more than that. I know what he means, and I agree with him. Next to Brian Ballot. Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I'm a history student in the graduate program here, Joey Thompson, and I just wanted to ask a couple of questions here. First, I'm interested at what point that these techniques actually become illegal in the eyes of the CIA or the congressional people in charge of overseeing them. And I'm referring specifically to a page in the report that says the techniques were legal when they produced previously unavailable material. That was according to a 2005 CIA report. So are we to assume that the CIA is at risk of being illegal only when their techniques don't work?
No, I would have said under the context in which this was put, that 38 times waterboarding for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was illegal. That's not what the guidance that Rizzo got out of the Justice Department said. This was a measured program that had been let out. You stand them on their feet for a certain period of time, introduce heat, right? But there's no notion that a technique like that, even if it were simpler, imposed upon an individual 38 times, and there were those that Zubaydah, that was just mentioned, was waterboarded even more than that. That's torture by anybody's scheme. We don't want to lose sight of the fact, yes, there's got to be accountability. We've got to find out, our historians will want to know what the CIA really did, what their directions were, what the relationship with the White House was. But we're taking a bath in the Middle East. You can't tell me for a minute that this hasn't contributed to ISIS and ISIL and all the rest. You can't trust the Americans. They'll behave just as the savage rulers that we think we've been operating under for the last couple of centuries have. It's a disaster.
So I think just on the legal question specifically, there was a genuine problem that the CIA confronted when it was handed this portfolio, which is that we had a law, the torture statute, that created it's a major felony with potential death penalty application in the event that somebody dies for torture. And there was absolutely no case law interpreting it. And the language of the statute is oddly permissive. It's draconian, and in my judgment, by the way, rightly so, if it applies, but it applies only in situations of the intentional infliction of severe pain and suffering, not just any old pain and suffering. And so if you're
38 is not enough?
well, no. Hang on a second.
It was 183.
So this is before anybody had waterboarded anybody, right? If you're, say, the lawyer for the CTC, or John Rizzo, who was his boss, or Scott Mueller, who was his boss, and your operatives come to you having a presidential finding, which Rizzo, by the way, wrote, that said detention and interrogation, right? You're authorized to do this with Al-Qaeda people. And so your operatives come to you with a really reasonable question, which is, what can we and can't we do? And you look at the statute that seems on its face to say you can do anything as long as it doesn't involve severe pain or suffering, which basically comes down to, you can go to jail for the rest of your life or face the death penalty based on the word severe and the word intentional. And they had to come up with the answer to the question, okay, what are you and aren't you allowed to do? Now, I'm not going to sit here and defend, Rizzo's a friend of mine. And by the way, his book is really worth reading. I'm not going to sit here and defend the specific lines they came up with, but I will say what John and his people decided was the formula answer to the question, which is, we're not going to let our people do anything that the Justice Department won't say is legal.
But we're going to destroy all the films that showed what they did. Come on, man.
That was against Rizzo's.
That was against Rizzo's will behind his back.
But if I can just say one quick thing about that, which I found, and I don't know Rizzo.
Sounds like a
I had never met him.
discussion to me.
But when I was in Washington, the saying around Langley was, when the revolution comes, the first ones to go are going to be the lawyers. And the reason for that was that the Office of Legal Counsel was incredibly strict in interpreting the law. And anything in doubt, it would say, you can't do it. They always erred on, I could tell story after story that were ludicrous about what we were not allowed to do because of the concern that it would cross the line. And when I read Rizzo's book, and it seemed it was trying to see how permissive it could be in terms of interpreting the law. So that was really quite different from my experience. And without, I don't have the expertise to know exactly where that line is.
Nobody does.
Right, and I think you're absolutely right that it's a moving target. It can be interpreted. But I would say that my interpretation after that is that the Office of Legal Counsel in the CIA was advocating or trying to allow the use of this, as opposed to when I would want to have a meeting and they would say you could not have a meeting because that could lead to some sort of ethical violation. So there really was this cultural change.
I think that's exactly right, and I think the mood went from the idea of all the restraints in the law to the idea that we should find as much permission in the law as possible. That said, there was a genuine problem that a lot of the critics of the CIA have never fully come to grips with, which is that if you read that law strictly, it still leaves a lot of room for a lot of coercion. And it may not leave room for waterboarding, much less waterboarding somebody multiple times, but it does leave room for a lot. And
What about the statute preventing cruelty?
well, the cruelty in human degrading treatment statute, which is the
This is Al
DTA,
Gomorrah. I mean, he
which
went
is the
ballistic in the Navy
but
Department.
the
against it.
DTA wasn't passed yet.
Right.
Right? And so there was this very hard question that they faced, which is, what are you and aren't you allowed to do? And the military, by the way, has solved this problem in a different way, right? So the military says, we don't even reach the question of the law. Here's the Army Field Manual.
Right.
We wrote it. Yeah. It's the law of the military. It's so far from the legal line, and it's designed that way. And the reason it's designed that way is because they have a bunch of 22-year-old kids who have to do these interrogations. And so they write rules that keep them very, very far from the legal lines. But one of the consequences of that is that nobody's ever really, until this program, explored the question of, if the policy directive is go right up to the line, put your toes on it, lean forward, what can you do?
Well, we've had one question and already a lively debate, so I'm going to work my way up from the back because the mic is down there. Alex?
Hi, I'm another member of the History Graduate Program. I'm curious about the relationship here between accountability, which has been touched upon, and the underlying concerns about transparency, both in communication between the CIA and other members of the government, as well as the public at large. I'm thinking here of the FOIA bills, for example, that are stuck on the Hill. Is there room in this discussion about torture for also broader considerations of public access to information?
Well, the access was given to the advice by the Office of Legal Counsel of the Department of Justice. They answered each of these questions with respect to the techniques that were to be employed by CIA, with personnel from the Office of Medical Services at CIA in attendance. That was the way it was to go down. And then with this enormous amount of time that they had, and the fact that they didn't have much expertise in going from X to Y, it got completely out of hand. There were videos taken, which were meant to be to control and somewhat, to see how accurately the officials kept to the promises that they'd made. Those have all been destroyed. It's an absolute fiasco, and the point is, we're not the only ones that know about this or care about it. You got to think ahead of time on some of this, and it's not as if we haven't been down this road in one fashion before.
So, in terms of FOIA, and for those who know, that's the Freedom of Information Act. Of course, for the CIA documents, those who would rule as to whether or not they can be released are the CIA. So the likelihood, as I said, of this becoming evident, even 25, 30 years from now, when the statute would have it, I would say are slim to none. The issue of transparency is, of course, very intensely debated now. And there are those of us who argue that transparency serves the national interest by signaling the type of society that we are. That is not the dominant interpretation at this point. So although there has been progress, I don't think that this relationship between accountability and transparency, as you set it up, is sort of a one-to-one relationship in which transparency will ever be used, at least in the foreseeable future, to be able to hold those accountable for perhaps trespassing over whatever that line was.
I would just add to that, that accountability and transparency in the specific area of covert action are very different things. Right. The definition of a covert action under the statute is an activity authorized by the president in which the hand of the United States is not anticipated to be acknowledged.
Not is intended not to show.
Is
That's a different word.
Yeah, and if you're engaged in an activity in which the premise is you're not going to acknowledge your role, transparency by the definition of the activity, has a relatively limited role. Accountability, however, potentially has a very large role, and that's what the intelligence committees are for.
Richard was just telling me before we came in that the 1953 volume on the coup in Iran is still held up and not being fully released because of contemporary sensitivities about U.S.-Iran relations. So there's always it's never a good moment to release the latest tranche of documents. Where are we? Sir, with the sweater, yeah.
What is the state of these practices now? Is there, you've talked about the legal justification. Has that changed? Do we know whether it's being done now or do we not know?
Thanks.
Closed down.
Do you want to take this?
Well, I mean, just that it's been closed down. It was closed down before the end of the Bush administration, and officially, in Obama's.
Well, I don't know, how can you say it's closed?
Well, you're right. I mean,
haven't seen
we'll
it.
go
I mean,
back
we
to
just-
transparency. But as I mentioned very briefly before.
We're not stupid enough to do it all over again right now, thank you very much.
But also, the drone campaign was not going on then. So at this point, many of those who were captured are now being vaporized. So it's a different type of
Torture.
thing, right?
It's a little
No, but it's important.
This is a very, very important point. Contrast only two captures or two operations. One is the operation that led to the capture of Abu Zubaydah. Abu Zubaydah is shot several times in the course of that operation. The CIA flies in emergency medical
Hopkins
care.
med, yep.
Yeah, very, very serious people. They do multiple surgeries on him,
Thanks to Buzzy Krongard, who was the executive director.
all to keep him alive for purposes of interrogation. That's 2002. 2011, an unarmed Osama bin Laden is shot to death at point blank range. And if you read the New Yorker account of that, as well as some of the books that have been written, this was a kill operation, not a capture operation. And that reflects a difference and many differences, but one of them is the sense of the urgency of interrogating al-Qaeda people over the change of those 9 years. And one of them also reflects a sense of, as I think both of my co-panelists have said, a sense of lessons learned, that you buy yourself a world of hurt when you bring people into an interrogation system without a good game plan for what the back end of that looks like. And one possible solution to that is have a good back end and don't do things in the interrogation program that you're gonna cause you problems on the back end. But another possible answer to that is don't bring people in the first place.
Let's see. We're working our way up to the front. Christopher?
Hi, Christopher Maternowski of the History Department. You sort of touched on this, but I was wondering if you could talk a bit more tangibly about the international implications of the interrogation program, other than simply eviscerating American credibility abroad. Thanks.
Well, look, I mean, the impact internationally has been very difficult, and certainly represents one of the highest costs of the program, and that would be acknowledged even by the people who are most defensive of it. And with the exception of Dick Cheney, who really seems to just have a bloodlust about this sort of thing, nobody I've talked to at CIA thinks that this is the way you would want to do things in the regular order, right? Nobody's a sort of enthusiast for CIA type RDI as a general matter. The defenders of the program will say it was a very small program. It involved a very limited number of people, relatively few of whom were subject to the most extreme techniques. But nobody except Cheney. Cheney is really an outlier here. Nobody says this is great, we should be doing a lot more of this. And one of the reasons is that the international blowback is very substantial. It causes all kinds of frictions, including in the CIA's relationship with liaison services. So this is an area where I think everybody agrees there's big costs.
Were you here when Aldo Mora came down to speak to the law school a couple of years ago? Well, he was the general counsel of the Navy. And this was going on all over the Pentagon, and he hadn't been cut in. Finally, he went to the general counsel of the Department of Defense and said, this is absolute insanity. Read the following statutes, cruelty and all the things we've done. Well, I mean, you know, it isn't as if the Washington in lockstep came behind John Yoo and the rest and said, we'll do this sort of thing. It was always controversial. And by the by, John Yoo last week was quoted in the press and said, what they did in those interrogation camps is not what I advised when I gave the opinion. Well, we almost rode him out of town on the rail a year ago, so that's what we thought.
Two specific questions. CIA was naive going into this, apparently. At least that's the impression I've been given. They're two very experienced organizations, and I wonder if they asked for counsel. One was Stasi, and the other was Hamas, or Hamad. Mossad, thank you. All those words sound alike after a while. The second question is, how many of these people were contract workers as opposed to actual members of the organizations?
I don't know the answer to the second question, but pardon me?
Just hang on a sec. We're getting some feedback from some piece of technology. Can you all check your whatever it is? Okay, now it's off. Good, thanks.
Yeah. I don't have, the second question, I don't think there was a, what was the first one, excuse me?
Had to do with Stasi and Mossad.
Well, what we were doing, we had the example, and it was already talked to by Professor Immerman. There was an FBI agent of Lebanese Arabic origin, American citizen, who had talked to Abu Zubaydah, this high-value detainee. God, I hate that word. He knew a lot. And he claims that in a non-adversarial period of the interrogation, he got all the information that later came out under constraints. So, and the FBI, I mean, you know, we're all working together on me. The FBI wouldn't be in the same room with the agency interrogators. They're a bunch of boneheads. They don't know, they've never done this before. We know this is going to end in disaster.
But did they go to Mossad and Stasi looking for...
No, we had it at home. We just didn't, that wasn't the team we put in the field. What the CIA brought to the program, as I said before, was they could get these people out of the mainstream of publicity. We could go to secret prisons in Poland, Romania. Nobody would, they wouldn't hear the screams. And it couldn't be covered. And that's the only thing they had going for them. But they tried in good faith. I'm not just saying they're a bunch of law breakers. They put a video camera on these interrogations. They're there until they were destroyed.
And about the contract workers, does anyone know to what degree contract workers...
Well, the two guys they hired to teach them how to interrogate were contractors at $2 billion.
I don't know the answer to that. I would be surprised if a large number were contract workers, although perhaps maybe early on, but it would have lessened. But I don't have...
The opposite is the case.
They got more as they went along.
You know, by the end of the program, it was almost entirely contracted out. On the foreign intelligence, the foreign liaison services, the Stasi didn't exist anymore by the time, just as a matter of historical practice. I don't know of any information that they consulted the Israelis about interrogation practices, but it is notable that the Israelis have had a very similar trajectory as we have in both exploring the legal limits of what you can do with what so they have a different set of euphemisms. We call them enhanced interrogation techniques. They call them moderate physical pressure, and which sounds even more ominous in Hebrew, by the way. And And they had a very similar trajectory as we did, which was to say that they had a policy of using it. It was not Mossad, by the way. It was their internal security service, the Shin Bet. And the Shabak had a policy of using it in a way we think Americans are litigious. The Israelis are really litigious. And there was eventually in, I think, I forget what year it was. It was right around the time our program was getting started. The Israeli Supreme Court issued an opinion rejecting the use of moderate physical pressure. And it's a fascinating opinion, and it's really worth reading, in part because it accepts, actually, that these programs are effective, which is exactly the opposite of what the Senate Intelligence Committee did. The Senate Intelligence Committee says, you can't do this and it doesn't work. And the Israeli Supreme Court, which is actually in my mind, a much more courageous opinion, it says, hey, the Shabak has made a completely persuasive argument that this stuff works, and you still can't do it.
But they do it, and it's a very important point you make, Ben. They've been dealing with hostile interrogation for a long time, irrespective of the fact that their Supreme Court does not approve it.
So here's a question that I want to take for a moment. I want to intervene as the chair here. We're down in the weeds to some extent, which is where this has to be sort of fought out. But there is still one large question, which is, does coercive interrogation of the kind that we've been discussing here really have any place in the United States democracy as we would like to imagine it? And if so, how successful do you think we can be in containing and constraining those practices? Or is it really the case, as you're describing in the Israeli case, that even if we think it might work, we won't have we would prefer not to have any truck with it? I guess I'm asking is, rather than just saying, was the Senate report accurate or is it flawed, let's at least spend a couple of minutes addressing the very big elephant in the room, which is, should we really be having anything to do with enhanced interrogation? And I think maybe each of you might have a view on this, and I'd love to hear it, and we'll see if we have any time after that.
Go, Ben. Go, Richard.
Put you on the spot there, Richard.
Yeah. So if I just say no, can we leave it at that?
Perfect.
I mean, I don't think that it has a place. And I go back to what I said first about sort of our values, but if our society is going to evolve and continue to evolve in the way that we hope it is, and if that evolution is tied to what we call our security and our integrity, I don't see how we can practice measures such as enhanced interrogation techniques without compromising that to such a degree that we begin to erode who we are. I could go on, but that's essentially the position.
A very well-known, now retired professor from the Harvard Law School, who is incidentally being sued for rape right now. That's another issue. But he was all in favor of torture warrants. Remember when that came out a year or so ago? And that's really gone nowhere because nobody knows how you bottle it in. How do you develop a procedural system that makes sure that this is tight? It's only under extreme circumstances does this go on. And furthermore, you're not going to stop a human being's reaction in a tight situation. If he has to blow somebody away to keep a crime from happening or something, he's going to do it. And the absurdity of the CIA school, 2-week training by people who'd never conducted an interrogation before, out in the middle of nowhere, situation where you're going into talk to people under absolutely controlled circumstances. So you follow the book for a certain period of time, and this guy's not talking, but you're persuaded he has the information. So you do it to him again. I mean, human nature is going to defeat these kinds of things. So back to your question. Since you can't really police it up, you better leave it alone and realize that people are going to take law into their own hands if it's really an extreme case.
So I'm tempted to simply say I agree, but I'm not going to. So here's a story about coercive interrogation, and I want to just a show of hands as to whether people think this technique is okay. Is okay. So, and I'm going to change a couple facts in it before I ask you the question. I'm going to tell you one version of the hypothetical, and then I'm going to tell you the true story. All right, so the CIA captures a major terrorist figure. And, I'm sorry, they can't find the major terrorist figure. But they find his wife, and they find his kids. And so here's what they do. They put the kids on a plane at an airstrip. And they tell the wife that the plane's taking off in 5 minutes for Saudi Arabia. And it'll be totally up to the Saudis what happens to her kids. On the other hand, she can tell where her husband is. And she does. And they capture a major terrorist figure. So here's my question. Is that okay? Anybody think it's okay? I got 4 votes. All right, so that's actually a true account, but it's not about a major terrorist figure. It's about a man named, whose name will ring a bell to some people in the room, Rudolf Höss, not Rudolf Hess, who parachuted into England during the war, but Rudolf Höss, who is probably, with his own hands, the greatest mass murderer in history. He was the commandant of Auschwitz. And the British forces couldn't find him after the war, but they found his wife, and they found his kids, and they put his kids on a train headed east. And they said to his wife, "Where is he? The train's leaving in 10 minutes." And that's how they caught him. Now, let me ask the question again. Who's sorry that the British did that? That's why we are not.
You already posited his guilt.
That's why we are not at the end of the question. All right, I got 1 vote. So 4 people say it's okay prospectively to do it, and almost everybody says they're not sorry it was done. And that's why we have not reached the end of the question of democracies using coercive interrogation.
I think he wants to take on your premise. Hang on.
I don't really feel that that's a fair premise because we're not Britons. If that was an American, I very much would be very upset that that had happened. I would very much have an issue with it.
Okay, so I'm saying, I could reformulate the question is, are you sorry that a great democratic society did that by way of catching the greatest mass murderer in the history of the world? Okay, look, the answer could be yes. My point is, yes, I have a problem with it. And actually, I have a moral problem with it. I'm not sorry it was done. And the difference between the prospective question, do you think we should be doing this, where we all say, of course not, and the retrospective question, which is, how sorry are you that it happened? That disparity is the reason that we have not reached the end of the question of when we use this stuff.
You've been waiting patiently. Last question.
Okay. My name is John Landweaver. I'm 89 years old. I take seriously your phrase in the introduction to your program, the broad hysterical context. With your permission, I'd like to tell you about a personal experience with the OSS.
A question. You got a question?
Well, do you approve of the CIA, the OSS lying to my uncle and implicating him as a spy? He was a missionary doctor in North Korea in 1937, and the OSS implicated him as a spy to protect their own spy.
But is this?
My uncle had to go to court and was rescued by Hirohito from prosecution.
Okay, so that kind of comes to the question of how many lies are we willing to be told in order to get something that we want, right? I suspect they're
Unnecessarily.
right. Right. And you had one last follow-up one. We'll get you the last word. Okay. Or not the last word, but the last question.
This kind of goes along with what we were just talking about, but I think the thinking has evolved with the police and with the military and with now the CIA, that it's easier to take somebody out than it is to go through the painful process of legal trial and incarceration, and it costs $40,000 a year for whatever. And so what has happened is that we don't take prisoners anymore. You know, we don't take hostage takers. We just take them out. The second point is that, do you think that Cheney has bellied up to take responsibility for the program because he will never politically think that anybody would ever try him as a war criminal?
You want to take that one? Are there any of you?
I'll address it. So look, one of the your first question is a very challenging one, and I think we have the luxury now. Part of the reason that we kill in situations that we used to capture is that we are not so afraid of Al-Qaeda anymore. We know a huge amount about its internal operations. We have decimated, absolutely decimated, its middle management. We've constrained it geographically. This is core Al-Qaeda, not the splinter groups necessarily. And so we are actually in a position where, confronted by an individual target who you can risk ground forces to capture, and then you buy yourself a world of litigation and international problems, or you send a drone strike, you don't have any ground force risk, you don't have back-end questions, you don't have to declassify any of the material.
Terror, in other words.
Well, you can, I mean, I'm not characterizing it, I'm just describing it. That is a very attractive option in that situation. That's not what we faced in 2002.
You and Hitler.
In 2002, the anxiety was that we did not know anything about what Al-Qaeda was planning. We had no people in its internal structures. We didn't know how big it was. And so the instinct that it was essential to capture people and interrogate them was dramatically stronger than it is today. And that's a relative reflection of the weakness that we felt at the time and the vulnerability that we felt at the time versus the vulnerability that we feel today. So part of it is just a difference of posture, honestly. And part of the reason I'm not prepared to simply say this stuff has no place, just write it off for now and forever in the future, is that I do think the society that feels differently about that basic question, where are you with respect to vulnerability, will objectively behave differently than the one that feels much more secure. And I'm not endorsing that feeling. I'm not saying therefore it's moral, therefore it's legal. I am saying that society is much more apt to experiment and to push lines than the one that has the option of just sending in a drone strike.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a cold day outside, but I think we've effectively raised the temperature inside the Miller Center in a very, very successful discussion, which clearly is not resolved, and that's the way we like it. Thank you all very much for coming.